It's February, which means Valentine's Day is coming up, and we have a special episode just for those of you who are looking for a spouse. Today, Dr. David K. Bernard is going to talk about what apostolic singles should look for in a spouse. We hope you will continue listening here to what he has to say. Dr. Bernard, as always, it is a pleasure to have you with us today. Now, you have adult children who are all married. You've been a pastor, so you've been in the position of giving advice, I'm sure, to your kids, to singles in the church about what they should look for in a spouse. So we want to ask you today, for all of our audience members out there who are single, who are looking for that special someone, their Valentine's Day is coming up, they're thinking about that right now. What advice do you have for them for what they should be looking for in a spouse?
Well, let me talk about God's plan for marriage. So if you go back to the beginning before sin, you see God's original plan. In Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, God created a man and a woman, and he said that they would leave their birth families, they would join to one another, and they would become one flesh. And one flesh, I think, means physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. So they're to consider themselves as one family unit, and their interests are intertwined. When the Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians 5 about the marriage relationship and went back to Genesis, he talked about the husband loving his wife sacrificially as he would love himself, and cherish and treat her the same, whereas obviously there's the implication that she would reciprocate that. So I think when we go to look at what marriage what we're looking for in a spouse, we first of all want to consider the will of God, and we want to consider lifelong compatibility. Also, I think we should keep in mind 2 Corinthians 6 says, "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers." Now, you could apply that in different settings, but I think the closest possible relationship of a yoking together or joining together two human beings is obviously marriage. So the number one criterion needs to be we have a common new birth experience, a common salvation experience. But beyond that common values, it's possible to be in the same church and have very different values is what you want in life, expectations, a pursuit of holiness. And while there doesn't need to be identity, I say identical ideas, we all have our own personal thoughts and feelings and convictions. But when it comes to the basic things, what are going to be our priorities? When we get a job, when we decide on where we're going to live, when we decide how to raise kids, there are a lot of things that come up. Are we committed to be faithful to church? Are we committed to paying our tithes? Because if one person says, I want to go to church once a month or whenever I feel like it, or I don't really think we should pay 10%, maybe 1%, well, then those are going to become flashpoints. When I was a pastor, I used a resource which I think is still available. There may be others that are more recent, but it's called Getting Ready for Marriage Workbook. And it had a number of questions that it asked, what do you expect? What do you believe? What do you think? And both the man and the woman were asking the questions, and then they would compare their answers. So it became a great tool because people that said, well, we love each other, but they didn't really know each other, and they would be surprised to think, oh, you believe that? Oh, you think that? Oh, that's your priority? And so it's best to get those worked out before you get married rather than after you get married. So I'm a firm believer in spiritual premarital counseling and some practical component to that. So I'd go back to your question is, number one, definitely a common new birth or salvation experience. Number two, very similar values when it comes to things like church, serving God, living a holy life. How are you going to raise and train your kids? Those things, you need to have a general agreement. You need to discuss. I think a third thing closely related to that, good communication. So someone you're going to marry needs to be your best friend or someone it may start with friendship, but it could start with a romantic relationship or an attraction, but there has to be a strong friendship developed at some point and a strong communication. Because if you communicate well, then every major problem can be addressed successfully. But if you communicate poorly, every problem can become a major problem. So someone you like to talk to, someone you like to spend time with, someone you communicate well. We have this in our Western culture, which I do think is correct. There is a strong feeling of romance and attraction and falling in love. Interestingly, I was raised in Korea many years ago, and it's changed somewhat now, but their tradition was arranged marriages. And in the very traditional form, the families would get together and they would decide who is going to marry who without the children even being involved. And then later it evolved to the children would have a veto power. But still, when I grew up, the common thing was, and you would actually even go to a real estate agent, and they had a book of people that are eligible for marriage, their education, their life experience, their family background, all this kind of stuff. And you flip through the book, find out people that look compatible. And then the parents would meet and they would talk, and then the kids would meet and they would decide if this is going to work or not. In church, they would ask the pastors to help with this. And of course, while I don't agree that that's what we should do, there's a valid point, because many of those traditional marriages, they lasted and they did develop into love. But the point I'm making is they really emphasize there's got to be compatibility. And if your family background and your educational background, your life experience and your culture is totally different, well, I'm not going to say it shouldn't happen. I'm just saying you need to be aware of that. You go in with your eyes open, knowing you're going to have to overcome some hurdles or some obstacles. You're going to have to work extra hard. And so the point is, it's not just that love will cover everything. It's going to be hard work. Now, I do believe love is essential. But what we think of as love, sometimes we meet someone and we're immensely attracted, and we call it love at first sight. Well, it's probably not really love at first sight. It's probably infatuation at first sight. What I mean by that, this person fits your profile that you've created in your own mind. And so whether it's the physical appearance or the way they react or respond, it fits. But whether that person actually is what you have dreamed in your mind, they're probably not going to be. There may be some points of similarity, but you're not going to really know until you get to know that person. So I do think there is no perfect match, no perfect person, and so you have to adjust your expectations to what is realistic, because nobody's going to fit all the checklists you have. And if you find someone that seemingly does, they actually may be deficient in something much more important, and someone that you would write off at first because they don't have the one or two characteristics. Once you get to know them, you may decide what I had in my mind is really irrelevant. What they have to offer is so much greater. So I think there has to be a process of getting to know the person. And obviously, I would say there needs to be a physical attraction. Obviously, there needs to be a romantic attraction and needs developed into love. But I would add to that, in the Bible, love is not primarily an emotion, but a choice. Well, obviously, there's an emotional component. But the point we sometimes say in Western culture is, well, I fell in love, almost like it just accidentally happened. I didn't really have anything to do with it. I just fell in love. But then the flip side of that is, a year or two later when problems arise, and in counseling people, I've had this happen. Well, I woke up one day and looked at them and realized I don't love them anymore, so I want a divorce. Because their concept of love was almost, well, if the romantic feeling isn't there, there's nothing left. Well, I hate to break the news to you, but some days you won't always feel the romantic feeling. But if you act according to your choice, then the romance will return. So my point is, I think we understand it's more of a choice and a commitment. And in a Christian sense, it's a covenant. So once we get married, that's supposed to be a lifelong covenant. And so I think going back to the question is, we have to look at that person. While we can't know the future, we can't know what they're going to be like 20 years from now. We can't know what we're going to be like 20 years from now. And we're going to change. And so marriage is going to require us to renew our commitment and to work hard again. And if it's a perfect match now, 10 years later, it won't necessarily be a perfect match unless you keep working at it, because you're both going to change. So what you have to understand is you're entering into this with love as a commitment, as a covenant. And once you do that, then you can be successful, especially with the Holy Spirit. But to go back to your question of what you're looking for, I think you have to ask yourself, can I see myself spending the rest of my life with this person? Is this person flexible enough that if circumstances change, I could see them being able to change with the circumstances? If I end up in a different career or different location or different situation than what I'm in now, is this the kind of person that will be with me and work with me? So I think you have to have a sense of what I see could be in the future. Do they have the potential, not just to be the kind of person that I want right now, but can they be the kind of person in the road? And we're all in a process of growth. So maybe they aren't everything you would want, but maybe you aren't everything they would want either. But do you have the capacity to grow, to learn, to develop? And do we have the commitment of love? And I do think we have to seek the will of God, which is another related subject. You do have to feel it's the will of God. But part of that is confirmation from the leaders in your life. So maybe not in every case, but many cases your parents know you very well, especially if they're also in the church. And you should heed their advice very carefully. If they have warning flags, then you should take that very seriously. And of course, your pastor. Now, as a pastor, didn't try to tell people, I found the will of God for you. You marry this person, or you better not marry that person. Now, if it was contrary to God's word, like one was in church, one was not in church, I would say, no, don't marry that person. But in the process of counseling, I'm not trying to tell them what to do. I'm trying to give them guidance. I'm trying to help them discern if they're truly compatible, and if they're not in certain ways, can that be addressed through communication and dialogue, or is this a deal breaker? So my goal is not to try to tell them the will of God, but I could help confirm the will of God, or I could help caution, even though you're both in church, and I can't say that marriage is sinful or wrong. I see some very different life experiences, or very different cultural backgrounds, or very different expectations, that I don't think you're ready to get married unless you're willing to work through these. And so if your pastor or another mentor or a parent has that kind of caution, I think that should be taken very carefully into account. And so seeking the will of God is not merely a mystical thing, but it's a practical thing, that you listen to your leaders and you listen to your mentors and you look at the objective evidence of how well do we communicate, what are our values, what are our expectations, and that's part of discerning the will of God. And I do think this, that God allows us to have a choice. So we might think, well, there's only one perfect person in the whole world that God has pre-selected for me. Only problem with that thought is, what if that person doesn't agree? Then your whole life is ruined, because the one person in the whole world that God selected for you doesn't agree. And so I do think there could be potentially many people, depending on circumstances, that could be the right person, and you zero down to the right one. And once you get married, there is only one right one. But until then, I think it's not as if, okay, I got to find out the perfect person once God tells me. And I remember a couple like that. Well, we don't really love each other, but God told us to get married, so we have to do what God says. And I said, wait a minute. God doesn't do that. God will work through our personality and our choice. So it's not rigidly, God has this one person He's going to shove on you, whether you like it or not. You better learn to like it. No, God is going to let our own personality and our own preferences and our choices, there could be a range of people that could be God's will, but based on your own personality and experience and your own preference, God will help you find the right one for you. I do think you can find the right one, but it is based on both God's will and leading and your preference and choice, and then ultimately, love is a commitment. So I hope that helps you in anybody that's seeking to get married or maybe counseling someone. I can just tell you my experience. I came back to the U.S. when I was 17, went to college, went to law school. So I was 7 years as a single adult, and I got married at 24. So I had to deal with all these issues firsthand, and I did find the right one, and I'm very glad I did.
Great advice, and I'm glad you touched on the idea that there being one special someone, because I think maybe that's a Western idea, but I think a lot of people get paralyzed looking for that one person that a bolt of light's going to shine down
Right.
on them and God's going to show them, when maybe that's not going to happen.
And often that's not realistic, and if they have that mentality and find the right one, they find out later that wasn't the right one. So it's better to go through the process knowing that there are options and possibilities. And I'll just tell you this briefly. When I first met my wife-to-be, I was a freshman in law school. She was a senior in high school, so we were about 4 years apart. And she was young and beautiful and the life of the party and loved God and was singing and leading in worship of this small church. And I was immediately attracted to her. And I asked her out. She turned me down. She did not like me. And over the course of time, I managed to get one date with her. I kind of maneuvered her into it she did some work for the church and work for me as teaching in the church. And so I said, well, the least I can do is take you out to dinner for all that you've done. And she couldn't refuse. So that was the first date. But she was so nervous on that date, I guess she didn't like it. So she, in the middle, announced, I'm sick, I got to go home. So I thought I won, but actually she won. So for the next year and a half, we were friends in church. We worked together in church. We worked in outreach. And so we had a relationship in that regard, but she wasn't interested in me. But a year and a half later, through circumstances, suddenly I realized her perspective had changed a little bit. So I tried again, and this time I was successful. And so I've learned from experience that sometimes the one you think might not be the one, or they might be the one, but you might have to go through some time for both of you to come to the same conclusion. But in the end, we trust that God will lead us, and that's been my experience.
I'm glad you shared that story, because I think you just gave a lot of young men a little ray of hope. So thank you for listening. God bless. Thank you for listening to this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to Dr. Bernard's channel, like this video, and leave a comment. We also encourage you to check out Dr. Bernard's books. Visit PentecostalPublishing.com and search for David Bernard to access a full list of titles. Don't forget to enter DKB10 at checkout to save 10% on your order. We look forward to seeing you again next week as we explore how modern-day believers can live out the teachings of the first century church.